Hi, so I wanted to go over soldering with you a little bit, and this will help you not only with this project, but I think any other time you need to solder. So let's get started. To begin with, I'm using a pencil soldering iron, and the name is respect to its shape. It has a finer tip than other soldering irons for more detailed work. I keep this in a stand that underneath has a small sponge. And the sponge I use to wipe off excess solder periodically to keep the tip clean, and so the solder action works better. Okay, so let's get started on soldering these LED strips. So when you get these strips, they're going to be in a long roll. And what you're going to do is cut them in strips, peel off the backing, and adhere it to the top of the lid. When you cut the strips, you'll notice that it has on the surface a piece of silicone. And the silicone normally acts as a lens. We need to take it off, however. The silicone will, over time, age and discolor, so it'll affect your light output and your exposure. So if you pick it up and just separate it with your fingernail, you can pretty easily pull it off. And then you're left with a strip. To adhere it to the top of the lid, you'll also need to peel off the adhesive strip. So again, use your thumb, pull back, covering this portion's adhesive, and you can just stick it to the lid. You'll also notice, if you look at this closely, that it has polarity. There's a plus and a minus to the strip. The plus side says plus 12 volts, and the negative has a minus sign. You'll also notice that where you cut it, pay attention to this when you're cutting it, you'll notice that there are, I'll put this back together so you can see what it looks like before it's cut. You'll notice that I've cut this where these small copper ovals are. These copper ovals are what we're going to solder to. It's where the insulation's been stripped off to reveal copper foil. And so what we're going to do first off is to tin this, which is just an application of solder directly to the copper to make the rest of the action easier. So we're just going to take the soldering iron and solder, heat up this copper foil, and then apply solder to it. I am using a fairly thin rosin solder. The rosin is in the solder itself. I don't have to coat the wire or the strip with anything. The rosin will help it flow better. So I'm just going to put the soldering iron here, and then let it flow on. Okay? So you should end up with solder on both sides of this. Then, the next thing we're going to need to do is attach and connect all of these strips together. We're going to need to pay attention to the polarity, the plus and negative. An alternative, however, to soldering would be to use these solderless connectors, which are also on Amazon. The intent of these is that you can put the LED strip in here, clamp this down, and there are small copper pins in it that press into the copper strip. I had intended to use these initially for this project. I just found them not to be very reliable, so I opted not to. And so one side, if you choose to go this way, would have the LED strip in it. The other side, you can put in your wire and clamp that down. Okay, so the wire we're using, and I've cut this into a small strip, is 22 gauge stranded wire. With wire, the higher the number, the finer it is. I use stranded wire. It's a better option than, say, solid core wire. Typically, your doorbells, I use bell wire. It tends to be a bit more fragile, and I prefer this. So I cut this into 2-inch strips and then used a pair of wire cutters, diagonals, to separate the two. If you don't have access to something like this, you can use scissors. That'll work fine. And then I lightly clamp into this. You don't want to clamp all the way through. You just need to clamp far enough to cut into the insulation but not the wire. And then I pull it apart, and I'm left with the bare strands. And then I take my fingers, I tend to wet them, and I twist this to twist the strands together. And then I'm going to do what's called tinning, which is heating, and I'm going to try and bend this up a little bit so it's easier. Or you could rest it on something. I'm going to heat the wire, and you try to heat the wire, not the solder. But I wanted to coat this strand with solder, so I'm not soldering to bare wire. And if you wish, you can trim this down. So this one's already been tinned. I'm just going to trim the edges a little bit. Okay. So, if you notice too, these wires have a red lead and a black lead. The red lead on any wire of this sort, this doesn't refer to the wiring in your house, only to DC, direct current. The red will be positive, the black will be negative. And so pay attention when you're wiring this and wire the red lead to positive, 12 volts, and the black to negative, the minus sign. So I'm going to hold this over my previously tinned connector, and I'm just going to melt it so it all flows together. I'm going to hold it in place till I'm sure it's cold, and then do the same with the negative. Okay? So then if I'm joining these two together, I would take the next strip and again make sure that I'm soldering the red lead to positive, the black lead to negative. If you do that, you should be fine. And if you have any questions, unsure about anything, just let me know and I'll help you out. Thank you.